Vic Mullen, the grumpy old Scotsman. Beginning of a new week, folks. Beginning of a new month. We're in December now. Can you believe it? Wow, it's going to be Christmas and New Year soon. So, as always, folks, if you like what you're seeing, hit the subscribe button down below. I should mention it every video, but I keep forgetting to mention it every video, even though I've got this right next to the bloody camera, and I still keep forgetting to tell people to subscribe. But anyway, subscribe button's down below. Doing something a little bit different this time. Plus, the Labour hasn't really screwed up much recently over the past 48 hours. There's still a lot of news going around about the previous video that I put out about Rachel Reeves essentially lying, just bald-faced lying about the predicament that the government's budget was in before she announced the budget that raised tax by 26 billion. Now everyone's basically sticking the knife into her. I'll be very surprised if she keeps her job. But then again, I won't be surprised if she keeps her job, because the way I'm looking at this, Keir Starmer wants to keep her around, because while everyone's throwing knives at Rachel Reeves, they're leaving him alone. But let's talk about politics in general. Over the past 30 years, roughly speaking, the past 30 years. It really started happening over the past 20 years. But over the past 30 years, British politics has become broken. There's no other way to describe it. It's simply broken. And why did that happen? And what led to something like that happening? Because if we cast our minds back, if you're old enough to cast your minds back to the Margaret Thatcher era, politics worked. There was a line, a definite line. It wasn't delineated, it was a line. And on one side, you had the left, on the other side, you had the right, and on that line, you had the centrists. Centrists were usually people like the Liberal Democrats, or the Social Liberal Democrats, or at that time, the Green Party, who were mostly centrist parties. But something changed. And if you go back through the history of British politics and the parliamentary system, British politics was some of the most stable politics in Europe. Because unlike most of Europe, which went for the proportional representation system, where there was very rarely any clear party with a clear majority, they all had to form coalitions at some point in time. And if you form a coalition, you make loads of compromises. With the British system, it was first past the post. Still is first past the post. But there was clear lines, always clear lines, between one party and another. If you look at Margaret Thatcher's era, or before Margaret Thatcher's era, you look at the era of Ted Heath and Wilson, you look at the era of Thatcher and Kinnock, there was clear lines. One side you had the Conservatives, centre right. Other side you had Labour, centre left. And there was always differences in their manifesto. Always differences in their manifesto before a general election. You knew if you were going to vote Conservatives, you were generally voting for slightly lower taxes and slightly more freedom if you were a business owner. You knew if you were voting for Labour, you were generally voting for slightly higher taxes, but slightly better services and slightly more rights, and slightly more rights given to the likes of the trade unions. So Labour was the working man's party, Conservative was the businessman's party. That was the lines that were drawn. And those lines were in place for the better part of 400 years, because the Conservative Party itself is one of, if not the oldest, political party on the planet. They have been on the go for centuries, literal centuries. The current Labour Party, as we know the Labour Party today, only popped up within the past 100 years. Roughly within the past 100 years. It was a collaboration with Liberals, a collaboration with Democrats, and when the Liberal Party and what was the old Social Democrat Party fell apart, the Labour Party was born. They were born pre-war. They first popped up before the First World War, and they first rose to power as a legitimate opposition to the Tory Conservative Party during the interwar period between World War I and World War II. But there was always a line. That line was always there. You knew what you were voting for. Whenever you voted Conservative, whenever you voted Labour, you knew what you were voting for. Things changed. Now, if you look at the current Labour Party and the manifesto pledges that they brought out, they've basically ignored most of them. And what they've done instead is implement what is essentially Conservative background tweaks to the manifesto pledges that weren't really Labour pledges at all. And then you look at the Conservative Party and look at the manifesto pledges that they were promising everyone before the last general election. You were basically looking at tinges of a manifesto from the Labour Party. Both the parties essentially started stealing ideas from each other. Now that never used to happen. Never used to happen. Until the era of Margaret Thatcher. What happened during Thatcher's era and the failed 3 attempts of Neil Kinnock and the Labour Party to basically oust Thatcher was the Labour Party started to become rudderless. Because what was happening under Margaret Thatcher's tenure, under her 3 consecutive terms as Prime Minister, a feat only equalled by Tony Blair, what was happening over those 3 consecutive terms, well, 2.5 because she was kicked out halfway through her 3rd term by her own cabinet, coming to think of it. But what was happening over her 3 consecutive terms was Thatcher was basically pulling the United Kingdom closer to the centre left. No, it's not centre left, centre right. Because before Thatcher, there was problems. I keep mentioning the winter of discontent, which happened under Ted Heath's tenure as the Conservative Party, but the winter of discontent was led into by the failed economic policy of the Labour Party, and everyone remembered what happened the last time Labour was voted into power. Everyone remembered, and not a lot of people forgave Labour for what essentially happened at the end. A lot of people, especially on the left, the old left of politics, got the winter of discontent and put that baggage of blame firmly on Ted Heath's lap. But as a lot of people ended up flatly admitting, once Ted Heath was kicked out of power, it wasn't really Heath's fault. Because many of the problems that led to the winter of discontent in the mid-1970s were basically formulated through failed economic plans of the Labour Party. It was Labour, remember, it was Labour who had to run to the International Monetary Fund and beg for Britain to be bailed out. It wasn't the Conservatives. Ted Heath was left with a bag of excrement that, let's face it, he was not capable of fixing, because Ted Heath was too rigid. He was old school Conservative, far too rigid to deal with the problems that the trade unions were causing, far too rigid to deal with negotiations with those same trade unions. And if you've watched, I think it was The Crown, from what I remember, during the period of time when Ted Heath was in as Prime Minister, I think it was The Crown where there was a scene where the actor playing Ted Heath was in the Cabinet Office and across from him was members of the Trade Unions Congress. And Ted Heath flatly refused to deal. And that's what led to the 3-day working week. That actually happened. In real life. He flatly refused to negotiate and deal with the Trade Unions Congress and the Mining Union, because the way Ted Heath seen it, the Mining Union and the Trade Union Congress were essentially holding Britain ransom. If it was a Labour Prime Minister, in other words Wilson might have caved, but that wasn't Ted Heath. Ted Heath had seen Britain essentially collapse around the Labour Party as trade union after trade union after trade union declared strikes. And when he took power, he negotiated a slim pay rise for most of the trade unions, but it wasn't enough. Hence the 3-day working week when most of the trade unions went on strike. But people remember the lead in to what Ted Heath was trying to do. And when Thatcher was voted in, it was Michael Foot at the helm of Labour. Labour was drifting aimlessly in the left wing of politics. And because of that drifting aimlessly that was going on, Foot left after the 79 election was won by Thatcher, and Neil Kinnock was put in Foot's place. And what Neil Kinnock tried to do was basically right the ship that was completely rudderless. The infamous, and it is an infamous speech that Neil Kinnock gave at the Labour Party conference just after the first general election, where he basically called out sections of the militant hard left of Labour for basically sacking everyone in the Liverpool County Council by writing letters and sending them via taxi to the people's front doors who were being fired. I remember that speech, and it was at that point where Labour started to stop listing and sinking. But here's the thing, Thatcher still got 3 terms. And to make matters worse, John Major, the most bland, boring politician ever to grace number 10 Downing Street, he actually won an election. So you're looking at 4 consecutive terms of Conservative rule. Unheard of. But people knew what they were voting for back then. Did you want to vote for Labour, who was responsible for wrecking the economy for essentially a decade that the Conservatives had to clean up? Or did you want to vote for the Conservatives under Thatcher and then under John Major for 1 term? Yes, the NHS became slightly underfunded under Margaret Thatcher. The cracks started to form in the national health system. But people were, generally speaking, better off, because Thatcher opened up the markets. Major continued with that deal of keeping the markets opened. The middle class expanded. And when you expand the middle class, and when you get chunks of the lower working class and expand them up into the middle working class, what generally tends to happen is the less working class people there is, the less votes there are for Labour. And that is the trick that Thatcher basically done. That's the trick that Thatcher done. She lowered taxes enough that people in the lower income tax bracket were saving up enough money to buy their own council house under the right to buy scheme. Therefore basically becoming not working class, therefore basically becoming lower middle class. And when you become lower middle class and you start to earn a little bit more money, you start to get pay rises, you start to get promoted, your tendency starts to shift towards paying less taxes and keeping more of your money. You vote Conservative. That's the trick that Thatcher done. And it worked flawlessly. Pardon me. The only downfall for Thatcher was the poll tax. If she had never implemented the poll tax, she would have served the entirety of her final 3rd term in office. But by that point in time, Thatcher had become drunk in power. Totally drunk with power. And her own party basically kicked her out and replaced her with a grey, boring person called John Major, who then went on to win the next election, albeit by a very slim majority, but he still won the election. And if it wasn't for Europe, the question of Europe, tearing John Major's cabinet apart, he would have won a 2nd term, which would have meant 5 consecutive terms of Conservative rule. It was at that point where the Labour Party knew something was wrong. When John Major won, Neil Kinnock knew his time was up. He left to be replaced by probably the best Prime Minister we never had. John Smith became the leader of the Labour Party. And what John Smith essentially done was put in sweeping changes to again do what Neil Kinnock done, but do it in the background. Remove the more militant, hard left elements of Labour that was putting people off from voting Labour and make Labour a true centre-left party, just like the Conservatives under Major were centre-right. John Smith had a heart attack, died. And Tony Blair became leader. And what did Blair do? Well, all of you out there who can remember the mid to late 1990s, who was looking, like me, a Labour supporter, although I don't think I was old enough to vote back then, was I? Oh no, I think I was. I was old enough to vote from 1993 onwards, from what I remember. But anyone who looked at Labour under Kinnock was looking at a tired, neglected, socialist, left-wing parliamentary party. And it was that socialist word, and I'm an old socialist and I'm the one saying this, it was that socialist word that put people off voting for Labour, because they could still remember what happened the last time Labour had a big majority. The lead-in to the winter of discontent. Everyone could still remember that. The 3-day working week, forced upon by Ted Heath, but he didn't have a choice. Everyone could still remember it. What did Tony Blair do? Well, he enacted lots of votes to remove certain clauses within the manifesto, the deep written manifesto of the Labour Party. I think one of them was clause 28 from what I remember. I can't remember the exact number of it, but it was one of the bedrock foundations of Labour, which made Labour the socialist working man's party it had always been. Tony Blair sauntered in and started stripping all that out. New Labour was born. New Labour. What Tony Blair essentially done was take a centre-left socialist party and turn them into a centrist economic party. Labour were no longer red. Labour were now light blue. They were basically the Tories, except without Margaret Thatcher and without all the scary economic stuff that was going on in the background when it comes to voting for a Conservative party. But here's the thing about Tony Blair. Tony Blair sweetened the deal by saying publicly that he will invest £500 million more year on year into the National Health Service, which he did. That he would invest £200 million more year on year into the education system, which he did. That he would invest, I think it was £150 million more spread across the country year on year to increase police numbers, which he did. He kept the core socialist elements, which made the Labour Party Labour. Free education, free healthcare, free services, a well-informed and well-budgeted police force, a well-informed and well-budgeted fire force. The core tenets of Labour, or at least old Labour. But what he did around that core is wrap it in economic Tory manifesto promises. Old school socialists like myself looked at Tony Blair and said, yeah, if this was a parallel universe, dude, you'd be the leader of the Tory party right now, but you're taking the core tenets of what makes Labour Labour, and you're bringing those ideas with you. You've got our vote. And that's exactly what happened. The 1997 election seen the utter collapse of the Conservative Party vote. And Tony Blair came into office for his first term. Then he won a second term, and then he won the third term and stood down. And then Gordon Brown took over. But on the run through of Tony Blair's many mistakes, some of which we're looking at right now, and we're looking at the repercussions of those mistakes right now, like open borders, that kind of thing. We're suffering the consequences of it right now. What happened to the Conservative Party? A seemingly centre-right party, they've always been on the right-hand side of politics. Look at what David Cameron done. Look closely at what Cameron done in order to win back a majority vote share. He got Margaret Thatcher's Thatcherite Conservative Party, pulled it from the centre right, and pulled it to meet Tony Blair right in the centre of politics. And it was at that point, ladies and gents, that British politics broke. Because for all these centuries, there's always been a left and a right, and a centre line where the Liberal Democrats or the Greens used to sit. But now, with the two major parties now sitting in the centre of politics, there's no difference. There's no difference. You look at what happened when the Liberal Democrats under Nick Clegg was given a choice. Sorry about that, jump cut. OBS Streamlabs started doing the flickering thing again, which I've never been able to figure out. But you look at what happened when Nick Clegg was given a choice. We were looking at a hung parliament. Gordon Brown, under Labour, didn't have a clear majority. David Cameron, however, Conservative, also didn't have a clear majority. Hung parliament. And it was up to Nick Clegg, leader of the Liberal Democrats, a staunch centre-left political group, to choose either Gordon Brown, who's an old socialist, leading a centrist Labour Party, or David Cameron, a staunch centre-rightist, leading a centrist Conservative Party. Everyone thought Nick Clegg would jump to Gordon Brown's side, because Gordon Brown's an old school socialist. Fits perfectly with the Liberal Democrats. What did Nick Clegg do? He chose the Tories. When it gets to the stage that the Liberal Democrats jump in bed with the Conservative Party, you know that that Conservative Party that David Cameron was leading is no longer a centre-right party. They're a centrist party with centre-left leanings. What David Cameron essentially done is what Tony Blair done to the old Labour Party. He pulled it away from the wings of the left or the right and threw it into the middle of politics. And the damage that done, along with the damage that Tony Blair done to the Labour Party, basically meant that there is no centre-right and centre-left of politics in the Houses of Parliament when it comes to the two major parties. Because both the Conservative Party and the current Labour Party, thanks to Tony Blair and thanks to David Cameron, are not centre-left or centre-right. They're centre. They're in the middle. They are basically the uni party now. They're basically both sides of the exact same coin. And that is why British politics is now broken. Because think about it. If you had a centre-right party in power, like Margaret Thatcher, you've got the centre-left, Neil Kinnock, constantly barraging Thatcher during Prime Minister's questions about the economic stability of her decisions, about why her decisions could be detrimental to the working class. And it was Thatcher herself that said in numerous interviews that she enjoyed Prime Minister's questions with Neil Kinnock, because Neil Kinnock asked her some of the most pointed and difficult questions of her entire political life. And it was because she knew that she would have to face Neil Kinnock across that dispatch box that some of the more, shall we say, scarier plans that Thatcher had for the NHS and the education system never happened. Never happened. Thatcher at that point in time during her second term in office was actually toying with the idea of partly privatising the NHS. But she knew she would be torn apart publicly by Neil Kinnock and Labour. So she bundled up that idea and threw it in the bin. Who was the one that actually did partly privatise the NHS? Tony Blair, under Labour. That's when you knew there was no left or right. There was no left or right. Both the Conservatives and Labour are now a big blob just a blob occupying the centre of politics. And that is why, ladies and gents, current politics is broken. We don't have a choice. You've got the blob centrist parties, and then you've got centre-right, which is Reform. There is really no centre-left political party out there now. Sure, some people can say the Green Party, but they're one step away from communism. Look at what the new Green Party look at what the new Green Party leader is saying publicly. They're one step away from communism. That's not socialism, that's communism. Nobody's going to vote for the Greens in the next general election. It's not going to happen. They might pick up some county council seats, but they won't pick up any MP seats. Because what that leader is saying is scaring off too many people. So now you've got the blob party of Labour and Conservative in one big blob in the middle, and you've got Nigel Farage all by himself with Reform, occupying the same centre-right lanes that the Conservatives used to occupy before David Cameron. And here's the thing. If Nigel Farage wins the next election, who's going to be the centre-left party that holds Farage to account? There isn't one. There isn't one. So does that mean that Farage's power basically goes unchecked? Because there is no centre-left party to hold Farage's feet to the fire? Who knows? Who knows? All I know is this. If Farage and Reform win the next election, the political reset button will have to be hit in order to make some kind of appreciable opposition party to go against Nigel Farage in the House of Commons. Because right now, if Nigel Farage became Prime Minister, there would be no opposition. There wouldn't be any opposition. Because none of the two major parties have got any kind of left-leaning bone left in their body, especially Labour. They don't. They're too centrist now. They're way too centrist. Anyway, I think that wraps up the video for today. Hope everyone has a good one.